Hi.
Hi.
Well, hello and welcome to We Can Edit This Out. This is a event about the podcasting do's and don'ts where we cannot actually edit anything out today. So everyone, no arms, your defamation law is up to scratch, all the rest of it. So this is all part of the National Young Writers Festival for 2020. I will start by introducing myself, then everyone else will get the opportunity to as well. So my name's Ellen Leabeater. I'm broadcasting from Gadigal country today, and I work for Guardian Australia on their news podcast, Full Story.
Hello, I'm Duriaden Hawk. I write fiction and poetry. I'm broadcasting today also from Gadigal country, and I'm co-creator of GB Club.
Hi, I'm Mariana Salem. I'm broadcasting from Awabakal country. I'm a Lebanese Aboriginal woman. I write mostly criticism at the moment. I've been published in Junkie, Kill Your Darlings, and The Big Issue. And I am also the co-creator of GB Club.
Hello, I'm Izzy Robertsaw. I am broadcasting from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country and also neighbouring Bunurong country. And I am many things. I can't sit still, apparently. I actually literally can't sit still either. So I'm a poet, a writer. I work as an arts worker with local artists in Maribyrnong and sit on a few different boards advocating for artists there. And in the podcasting realm, I am a co-founder and co-director of Broadwave Podcasting Network, which produces a bunch of different awesome podcasts that I'm sure I will tell you about shortly.
Well, yeah, let's get stuck into that. Izzy, why don't you continue and tell us a little bit about the podcast that Broadwave makes?
Sure thing. We have quite a few different podcasts on our roster. So Tender by Madison Griffiths is one of the podcasts that we put out, which is about what happens when women leave abusive relationships. Quite a lot of people might have heard season 1 of Tender, and she's currently working away with Beth Atkinson Quinton, who's another one of our co-directors on season 2, and collaborating with a fantastic woman called Roya in Perth, which is really interesting in the context of this year. They're making the podcast from different places. And then we also, Arij Noor is another one of our co-founding co-directors, and she is working with Haylin McQuire on a podcast about Black motherhood. And we're announcing the new title of that soon. So just stay tuned for that one when we've got the artwork up on our website shortly. We also produce a podcast called Dramageddon in partnership with the Queen Vic Women's Centre. You're making a big grin, Mary. Have you listened to it? It's so much fun. It's like basically a podcalypse. So it's a queer choose your own adventure podcast made by Jean Tong and Lou Wall, who are Dead Set legends. And basically they get on different queer women and non-binary people to do a choose your own adventure that's set in the apocalypse. So in this apocalypse, no one survived except queer people. So it's really, really fun and really silly. And hopefully we'll be looking at season 2 for that as well soon. We just produced a really awesome episode of that with Candy Bowers and Nebo Zisson that was part of the Melbourne Writers Festival. Shout out to other Writers Festivals. We love them. Having to do digital stuff this year. And then, oh my God, I'm not even finished yet. There's All Ears as well, which came out in April, produced by Annalise Redlick, again with Beth AQ. And that is a podcast about music and daily life. Really beautiful work. You can listen to it through Spotify or wherever you like to listen to your podcast. Or it's also being broadcast on ABC RN for summer. And then finally, which I guess I'm kind of publicly announcing here because it's not up on our website yet, is we're working with Liminal Magazine and making a podcast which is going to be absolutely sick. So Lisa DeVisi and Alan Whedon are co-hosting and co-producing that. We are working away on it, and the inimitable Leah Jean McIntosh is the editorial guidance for that. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out with a kind of what do you call it? Like a pilot season. That's the words. I need words. It's so late. And that's coming out early next year. Yeah, that's a lot of podcasts.
And our two Gaby hosts, why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. You go. I like what you wrote for this question more than what I wrote.
Okay, so Gaby Club, we're an independent podcast. We discuss LGBT cinema and television and just how we relate to it as gay people of color. But our episodes, they cover an extremely broad area. We do reviews, we do critical analyses, we do queer subtext readings. We look at tropes and patterns and how various media chooses to represent LGBT people and issues. And we have a lot of fun doing it because we're genuinely obsessed with this kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually just decided to start essentially recording our normal conversations for people to listen to.
Well, I think it works because you're not two white dudes saying like, I'm going to record our conversation. I'm sure we'll get to that podcast ideas later, but that's my preview. That's my most hated bad podcast idea category. At The Guardian, I work on our news podcast, Full Story, and it's a narrative news podcast. So we differentiate ourselves because we spend a lot of time preparing our interviews, preparing the structure of how we're going to tell the story. And I think that's what makes a very interesting news podcast from The Guardian angle. So yeah, that's what I do. Let's have a chat about what is a good podcast idea.
I will just answer that. Is that okay?
Go for it.
I don't know about good, but I think what makes an engaging podcast is, for me at least, is a unique point of view, or a unique voice or group of voices, specifically like a group of voices or a voice that want to give like an audience something to take away from each episode or each installment. Whether that's an affirmation or a laugh or critical ideas or advice or just escape. I think like a podcast worth listening to is one that you come away from feeling like you've sort of gained something good, whether that's like knowledge or just a good feeling. And I think a quote unquote good podcast idea should be generous in that way. Like you should be able to give your audience something, I think. Yeah.
Does anyone want to build on that?
I love that you said generosity. I feel like that's a really great thing to bring up. I feel like specificity for me is something that's really important about podcasting. The reason that I fell in love with the audio medium in the first instance is the intimacy of it. Like I've got my big headphones on now, and it's, a lot of the podcasts that I particularly loved at first, like I always talk about The Heart by Caitlin Press because I'm obsessed with her. But that was one that, I listened to the first season many, many years ago, and she just was so direct and generous. Generous is the word I would use for it, and really explored things from a lot of different angles with just kind of specificity and generosity. And that's what made that really compelling listening for me. And I think podcasting sits in a space as media that's, so much of the promise that's often talked about it is in relation to it being outside of a lot of the media institutions that we've inherited, and its ability to talk back to that sometimes. So again, speaking about Broadwave and what that does, the whole point of it was we wanted to take community broadcast principles of people being able to represent and speak for themselves and, speak in ways that maybe you can't do in a big media institution. So I feel like a lot of the promise of podcasting was seen as this kind of, what can you do outside of that? Or I'll get to it a bit later. I think it's actually a lie sometimes that just anyone can start a podcast and do it well, or the resourcing question is one that I think is a big thing to talk about. But those things, like it is an accessible medium, and if you're being specific and generous to your audience, that's going to make compelling listening.
Julian?
Julian, sorry.
Julian.
It's building off what Izzy said, like I think it's a strength if you're like very niche and very specific. Because I feel like, if you have a specific audience in mind, you get to be as generous as you want. Just as long as there's a voice that you're not used to hearing, I think that's what makes a good podcast. That's what makes a unique podcast. That's what makes it different from like just reading the news and, as you said, other media institutions.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of those points. And I think it's important when you're starting a podcast to think about not duplicating what's already out there, because there is a lot of duplication. So, really think about how your podcast is going to be different, what voice you're bringing, what niche you're serving, and who your audience is. Like all those really basic questions do help make a good podcast. Okay, and the other end of things.
To follow that on though, I think like people sometimes don't do their idea because they think it's too niche. So, or that they're like, I don't know. I was thinking of People Movers, the podcast that Lindsay Green makes. It's literally about escalators. Like, why? But at the same time, like that's amazing. She's just obsessed with escalators, and she made a podcast about it. And I think about that in the context of Gay V Club as well, right? Like when I think about that's maybe one of the promises of digital media and podcasting in comparison to our old forms of media, where community broadcast, like, is my favorite example because I love community radio. But, there's literally a radius that you can listen to that station in. Although now I guess you can listen to it anywhere because they're streaming online and have learnt a lot from podcasts. But with Gay V Club, like that's a niche interest perhaps, but I'm curious to know whether you have connected with audiences outside of like Gadigal country or Awabakal country. Like, are there people that listen from elsewhere as well that you might not have otherwise reached?
Yeah. Oh, you go, Dean.
Most of our listeners are from the US, actually. And then amount is Australia. And I like that we've been able to reach that many people. We actually have like more non-binary listeners than male listeners, which I love.
I don't know, one of the things, like when we were thinking about starting Gay V Club, just speaking to that specificity and wanting to reach an audience, like part of the reason I wanted to do it was because I am a queer woman of color who enjoys media, and I didn't hear like any voices talking about that, or at least at the time I couldn't find any. I've actually since found other similar sorts of people talking about stuff, and it's been really cool. But I sort of wanted to create something that I would want to listen to. So just speaking to that whole idea of, thinking about your audience, like, not to sound strange, but the audience was kind of me. It was sort of us. We wanted to hear this. And yeah.
In saying that, I say think about your audience, but obviously your experience, and I know quite a lot of other podcasts have found an audience that they didn't expect to find. So I know there's the really common example that I hear all the time is a lot of dating podcasts where it's, a couple of women talking about their dating experience tend to get a lot of men listening because they like being flies on the wall on like female dating life. So yeah, I always find that like super interesting. What about bad podcast ideas? What should we be avoiding in the podcast space?
What do you think?
But I think it's just anything impersonal, like really just the inverse of what we just said, how you got to be niche and specific and passionate about what you're talking about. There's anything impersonal. Like I know that there are several like daily download podcasts out right now that kind of just update you on the news, and I feel like they're very apathetic, I think, which is a bit scary and a bit sad. Like obviously, like it's important work to put the information out, but there's something about it. It's like I don't need to listen to a podcast for this, you know?
Yeah. No, and I think for me as well, what makes a bad podcast is like one that's entirely self-serving, like that idea that you hear like a bunch of white guys like, oh, we should just record ourselves, drinking beer. Why? Why do you want it? Like I'm sure it could be good, but like, why do you feel the need for people to hear that? I guess that's just a question I'd really encourage people to ask themselves, because I feel like a lot of podcasts out there are self-serving, and that's okay, but it should also like give something to people. It shouldn't just be for yourself because you want to hear you and your boys, chat about I don't know what do men talk about. I don't know, but whatever they talk about on their podcasts.
That's an interesting one because I feel like this point is one that's both. It's sort of like you have to hold two competing things in your hands at once, because on the one hand, if you think something is interesting and worthwhile, you have to trust that there's other people in the world that also think that. But then maybe there's questioning why you think that thing is interesting and worthwhile, because not every single thing that you think is interesting and worthwhile is going to find an audience or be engaging for other people. So that example of just like a conversation with mates is like, what is it about that conversation with mates that is going to be like relevant or interesting to other people? What's the angle on it, I suppose, is maybe the question. Yeah, I don't know, and you can find an audience for that. I think it's really interesting, like something that has been proven time and again is how important hosts are. And I sort of like, I don't know how I feel about that in some ways, because I think there can be a bit of a, like, I don't know, myth of the auteur, or this kind of holding up, like Ira Glass is the perfect example, right? Or even, yeah, I don't know, there's plenty of examples, but he's maybe like the OG from American podcasting of like This American Life, and how recognizable his voice is and how much his framing, despite the fact there's so many producers that work on that show and there's different hosts for different segments and so many different stories that come through it, a lot of that listenership is tied to this like identity of this one person. And I'm sure there's plenty of other examples as well, but I would push back against that a little bit. But I do think that a lot of the time what listeners are engaging with is like your specific take on the thing, and they feel like they get to know you, and there's kind of an engagement, like that intimacy that I was talking about before. So I suppose maybe like this has been said, I think that, that what makes a bad idea is something that isn't serving that. Yeah, and being generous and specific and connecting with your audience, making an effort to do that.
Yeah, a question to ask, I think, is also like, why does it have to be you saying this? Yeah. And
Yes.
I wish more podcasters ask themselves that.
What do you think makes a bad podcast, Ellen?
I really hate long, unedited, rambly stuff. So I think if you're also starting a podcast, to think about the value of your listeners' time. They're coming to you, and don't waste their time. Like, don't give like a 2-hour podcast in 4 parts with like one guest. Like, okay, sure, an hour of that interview might be interesting, so cut it down and appreciate your listeners' time would be one of my big tips.
So editing makes a good podcast then too.
Editing makes a good podcast. And maybe we should segue here to, have we picked up any editing tips and tricks? Maybe if we like talk about what programs we're using to edit as well.
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can kick things off. So at The Guardian, we use Reaper. And so I've used like Audition, Pro Tools, Audacity, Wavelab, and now I'm onto Reaper, and I am like 100% obsessed with it. Mariana, you're nodding. Are you a Reaper user too?
Oh, no, I was nodding when you said Audacity.
Okay, well, like I'm gonna convert everybody to Reaper because it's free and it's extremely customizable. And yeah, it's super easy to pick up. So we have, well, not myself, my boss has spent a lot of time thinking about what is the quickest way to edit and put those shortcuts into our Reaper build. So this is part of the reason why we can successfully turn over podcasts as quick as we can. And hopefully, I think the plan is to make it accessible to everyone at some point in the future. So watch this space. But
Awesome.
yeah, that would be, so my current editing tips and tricks is to edit the hell out of your out of Reaper to make the most out of your editing time.
Okay. We'll have to look into that.
So who edits Gay V Club?
Mostly me.
Yeah.
I'm like an editor at heart. Like, so like even before we started Gay V Club, like I love editing. I'm interested in film editing. I want to work in book editing. And so it was really nice when we started this, that like this skill could translate, I think. But I'd say the main thing that I like to stand by, like other than like the programming and your methods, is it's editing becomes so much easier if you've prepped well before recording. Like usually before we record an episode, I like to plan the structure of how we're going to have a discussion, and like choose which order to introduce our main points. Like we don't follow a strict script because we love the conversation kind of format, but I like having that outline, and we just moderate each other as we go along.
Izzy, what about you?
I feel like that's a really good point, Dorian. Like, I think it depends on the type of podcast that you're making, is the first thing that I would say about that. So, for example, if you're making creative audio, like when you listen to, you know, beautifully constructed like fiction podcast or something like a kind of, oh my God, documentary, that's the word I'm looking for, podcast that's, you know, got multiple sources and like clearly being produced. Like I think sometimes listening to, maybe that's to do with resources actually as well. So when you listen to something and you realize that there's like a team of 6 producers that worked on this thing for like a year, it's like, of course that's going to sound like have all of this detail in it. And if there's like an audio engineer who's like doing sound design for it, and then there's someone whose job it was just to write the script for it, and voice actors and stuff like that, obviously the process is going to be really different than if you are making a podcast from your wardrobe that has your single narrative voice to it. One example I actually really love in that regard is Welcome to Night Vale. So smart as a fiction podcast because it is one narrator. And so what I love, like that structure is actually compared to a lot of other fiction podcasts, quite a lot easier one to kind of to do. They don't need so many voice actors as compared to like The Truth, which has heaps of voice actors. Or there's some improv fictionalized podcasts that I really like as well. But so re-editing, I think scripting is a great idea. And especially if you have a conversational podcast, that idea of going in with a structure and a set of questions is super helpful to make sure. I think something a lot of people don't know before they produce audio is that it might be like, you know, 3 hours worth of tape to every hour that you actually use. Like the ratio of how much you record to how much you actually use can be quite vast. And I think back to what you were saying before, Ellen, as well, with just edit. I think a lot of first-time audio producers make the mistake of just like pop your recorder down and then you just like let the conversation go. And then you're like, wow, we got so engaged. We talked for 2 hours and this is supposed to be a 12-minute segment. So that's another thing I would recommend thinking about is like, be aware that the amount of tape you get, you have to go through all of that tape again in order to edit it down.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a real balance because on the one hand, you do want to let the conversation flow. Have as much tape as possible. Like oftentimes I'm getting people to answer the same question in different ways just to get a different response. And I'm like, oh, that was good, but can we add this extra thing in it, you know? But that just down the line makes your editing life a nightmare.
Although one trick with that is to take time codes. So if you, when you're recording, write down that at 12 minutes 01, Ellen made that really good point. And that way, when you're going through the track, rather than having to listen to 3 hours of tape and transcribe the entire thing and then find the point where you're looking for, transcription is another advice I would give people if you can do that. There's quite a few good AI transcription services now. They won't be perfect, but it will do the trick. I've used Google Sheets before to do this when I really didn't have money. So I played the track and I used the Google Sheets like voice to text function and had to keep refreshing my computer so that it would stay awake and record it all. But that was enough to make it easier for me to edit the tape. So a transcript really helps. Taking time codes when you're recording really helps. Knowing what your resources are. So if you don't have a lot of time, try not to get 3 hours tape, try and contain it so you don't have to spend so much time editing. Being prepared before you go into your interview. And really quickly, the software that I use as well is Audacity is a great free option. As Mary said, Reaper is also free, or like what, $60 for the license, Ellen? Something like that if you decide to pay for it.
Yeah.
I love Audition, but it's like $30 a month or something. So they've made it really expensive. Didn't used to be. So Reaper would be the one I'd probably recommend to people because it's more complex than Audacity, but you can learn how to use it. I also recently got to try Isotope, and I was like, this is so nice. It's really expensive. That's like for very professional, fancy audio engineers, but it just like you put through tape that is destroyed and it fixes everything magically. So if you're loaded, maybe that one's good.
I believe we are having an audience question right now.
Ooh.
What equipment are you using to record your podcasts? I actually got to pull out my Zoom H5 yesterday to do an interview, and I've got a Rode N200, I think, shotgun microphone. And I find that's really useful for going. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing is, if I am doing anything audio related these days, is outdoors. So that's really good for getting a lot of ambient sound. Whereas this is bad. I couldn't tell you what we're using in the studio. So somebody else jump in and give some studio advice. Maybe Izzy?
Sure. I think if for anyone that is based in Naarm in Melbourne, there's some really great libraries that have recording studios now, and you can hire them for really cheap. Obviously not at the moment while everything is still like in lockdown land, but when things open up again, the Kathleen Syme Library and the Docklands Library both have sweet recording studios, and they're like $11 an hour to book. You have to set up all the gear yourself, and it's set up to be a session musician recording studio, but it's awesome and so cheap and so worth it. The other thing you can do is hire, sometimes community radios will hire their studios out to you. Like 3CR does that in Melbourne. I don't know if different cities have that, but that's a really awesome way. Yeah, it's an awesome way to support your community broadcaster as well. If you can pay for a studio to pay to use their studios, and then that folds back into awesome community stuff. So studio mics, I don't know, I guess at home, I really want one of those shotgun mics. They're sick. I feel like a shotgun mic is a great idea for multiple kind of applications because, like Ellen said, you can use it to record ambient sound or like very specific audio to do creative audio stuff, and it also is perfect for vocal mic, and you can take it out and about. At home, I have a Zoom H4n, so that's the same as Ellen's, but the model before. I highly recommend them. They're old, but like good, pretty hard to break. I drop things a lot, so that's really good. And they have an inbuilt mic, or you can get an external mic through XLR. And I have a couple of vocal mics, SM58s, which is basically the type of vocal mic that you would have if you were doing a gig at a live venue. Again, got them because they're super durable and it drops things a lot, and mics can be very sensitive. I think apart from that, good pair of headphones, extremely important, and making sure that you don't get ones that are designed just for DJing, because often the bass is turned up too loud, and for vocal editing, it can kind of warp what you're listening to. What are these? ATH M40X. Yeah, Audio Technica has some pretty good stuff as well. Rode mic's always a good bet, and so are Shure mics. But a Zoom is like a perfect thing to start with if you're recording stuff at home. Yeah.
What about Mariana and Julian? What are you using to record at home, and how are you recording at home?
It's Duriaden for Daya's name, but also, this is gonna sound crazy compared to all that technical talk. We are very basic. We are both uni students, and we don't have a lot of resources, and also because we live in different cities. The process by which we record and the technology we use to record our podcast, we actually just use our phones. We use the microphones on our phones. We try our best to make home studio conditions. I think in early episodes, despite the fact it was middle of summer, we were getting under tables with the blankets over there. We were building like cubby house studios in the middle of 40-degree heat, so that we could record and it would sound like, and to minimize the reverb. But really, we just use like voice recording app on our phones. And now that we're recording separately, what we tend to do is sort of the same thing. I record on my phone. I usually call Daya on their Messenger, and I listen to the conversation in Messenger, and I'm recording my voice on my phone, and then Daya does all the editing. Puts the tracks together in Audacity, and the edit is done from there. We really just use our phones and Audacity. We are saving up. That's why we set up a Patreon, so we could save up and buy like proper equipment. But we are at the moment just using our phones.
And there's nothing wrong with the phone. We've been using the phone with our recorders during COVID. So in a lot of cases, we had like Zoom H1s, and the phone is better than the Zoom H1. So, nothing wrong with the phone.
Phone mics are good, and also headphones that have a thing on them.
And just like as long as you've created like decent conditions, like it should be fine to clean the audio afterwards as well.
Yeah, that was a great tip. The blankets. Recording on a 40-degree day underneath a huge doona is like still the worst thing ever. But and to that point, maybe USB mics is something that I'd recommend to people as well, that are like, not too expensive if people want to do something like that. I also wanted to recommend Zencastr for anyone who's recording from different places. So using your phone and your computer mic to get audio that is matched up. I know people have used Zoom for recording too, but Zencastr is like a specific audio recording platform for guests that are in different locations, and it's pretty good.
What we kind of tiptoed around what are decent conditions to record in, but can we get a little bit more specific on how to make your audio as good as possible, especially if you're doing it from home?
Close to the mic. And if you can get like a muffler thingy.
Like a wind muff, is that? Yeah,
just to like stop any of the noises from popping. Like that's all you need, really.
Yes.
Socks also work well for a wind sock, like literal socks.
I would say a room with soft furnishing is usually pretty good. So bedrooms are better than lounge rooms. And doona over the head is the ideal. Or even actually a car is a good place to record because it's pretty well insulated too.
We have recorded.
We tried that once.
We recorded an episode in the car.
So what about any other practical considerations that you need to think about before starting a podcast?
I feel like a big consideration, and it's not technical, but I feel like it is still a big one, is time. I feel, especially when you're doing something like we're doing, which is a passion project, you have to really reflect, do I have the time to dedicate to not just, recording this podcast, but planning it, but editing it, promoting it, and all of that. And in that same vein, like it has to be something that you are excited to do, because otherwise it's just going to feel like it probably would feel like a chore. We love doing Gay V Club. We have like such a great time doing it. I don't know. It's sometimes I like people ask me like, oh, it's like technically your job. It doesn't feel like a job because it's so much fun. But it also is very time consuming. And I'd ask like the biggest practical consideration, especially for someone like me who's really bad at time management, because yeah, I know. Don't look at me like that. I'm really bad at time management. You are looking at me. I can feel it. I'm really bad at time management, but you should really consider like, do you have the time, even if you are bad at time management, to dedicate to this? And do you have the passion to keep going, even when you don't have the time? That's probably my biggest practical consideration.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. I have done a bit of freelance work in the past, and the amount of people who come to you are like, oh, I really want to start this podcast, super keen to do it. And it lasts all of, like 10 weeks maybe, because everyone realizes how time consuming it actually is, like preparing guests, or finding guests, preparing guests, doing the editing, listening to it over and over again. And promoting it as well. It's a full-time job. I wanted to, so when you guys make your product, how do you know, well, and for anyone who's making a podcast, how do you know if it's any good? What do you do to get feedback on your podcasts?
I feel the socials are great. Like using social media and encouraging listeners to interact on social media so that you can get that feedback is quite good. Especially through Patreon, like if you can like message people directly and like ask them questions, that's also really helpful as well. And it's good, especially if we're like announcing our episodes, like, and we can find out like what people are excited about as well.
Do you take like recommends on the content, Juriaden?
So we have we do take requests for like the general episodes where like that we just like put up everywhere. We get like a bit more specific with this, so I think maybe we've only done like one request. But like with Patreon, we're just like at people's whim, like we'll do anything
because they're giving us the mullah.
Yeah. I think like a lot of the requests also just come from like friends and like people like us, like just in our orbit, being like, have you talked about this yet? Have you considered this yet? Because I remember Mary asked me to start a podcast with her at the end of 2018, I think. And we didn't actually do it until the end, like towards the end of last year. So that was just like, we spent like a whole year just compiling like a whole Google Doc of things that we know that we want to talk about that we don't think anyone else is talking about, but what we think is relevant. Especially because it's, to do with like film and TV. So you look at what's relevant and like you try to look at what angle no one else has approached it.
Yeah.
That's such excellent advice. I think back to the good podcast, bad podcast questions. Sometimes maybe bad ones are where people haven't done that thinking before starting, and you'll learn so much from the first episode every time. So comes a point where you've done all your planning and you just have to get it out there and get people listening to it. and adapt from there, and know that you'll grow and change, and you'll listen back to your first episode and be like, whoa, okay.
That was
yeah. But you can really tell when someone's done that and had a Google Doc for a year and really thought about it. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, it's like a manifesto. Like you need like a plan of action really, and just carry it out that way. Yeah.
Do you have a manifesto? Like, is there?
We do have a manifesto. We've actually completed every single thing. We've done every single thing on that. And we're like, oh, what do we do now? But
yeah, on
actually,
our OG
over the course of doing it, we just have more and more ideas, and like because more and more people are interacting with it and like telling us what they're interested in, we can have a look through there.
And also, I guess the beauty of being like a media podcast is that there are there's always things coming out. I think in our last series / volume, we only did one of the things we planned to actually talk about in that volume, because the rest were just things that happened to come out during the year that we were like, oh, we can talk about this. Things like The Half of It. That was an episode we hadn't planned, but the movie came out and we were like, well, we have to talk about this. What were some of the other ones? Was Portrait of a Lady on Fire one we planned, Dee, or not?
Yeah, I think we always planned that one, but
yeah. But yeah, I think that's the beauty of us being a media podcast, is that there's always stuff to talk about.
Okay, we've got time for one more audience question. How much preparation do you put into writing podcasts?
I feel like this is kind of what Mary was saying, re-time preparation. I am similar, and everything always takes longer than you think it will, is how I feel about that. So in terms of, that's maybe just more advice about how much preparation. Something that I think marketing is like how long is a piece of string, and so is editing. Those are two things where it's just like you could just edit it forever. You could just always be making it different and new. And the same thing with marketing. You could be improving upon or doing a million posts or finding different media to feature your work to try and reach more listeners. And so I think setting aside a fair chunk of time for those things is really important. And also understanding that your timeline may well blow out, especially if it's something, most of us have to do this around other jobs to pay our rent and things like that. So cutting yourself a bit of slack too when it takes you longer than you think it will to reach that deadline, and being kind to yourself. But yeah, in terms of how much preparation, again, it comes back to different forms. Like it really depends on what type of podcast is being made. So how much preparation do you put into writing podcasts? Depends on how scripted the podcast is, whether it's an interview or discussion-based thing. I'm really into fiction podcasts, so that's quite a long process of scripting, editing, sitting with it. So, yeah, how long is a piece of string? I don't
know. Jordan and Mariana?
It's similar to what I said earlier. Like, I prefer to be like well prepared, but we aren't always well prepared. Last night we actually recorded an episode where we were so prepared. Like, we had like everything ready, and I was super impressed because I was like, oh, we're not saying so much. We're not like spending too much time articulating our notes. So even though we can't always write, we can't always be prepared, but when you are, like, it's the best feeling.
And I suppose in terms of like different formats, like for what we're doing at The Guardian, I'll spend maybe anywhere between 1 hour and half a day preparing a structure. It just depends how complex the story is that we need to. And I think I may have cut you off there, Mariana, sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. I've actually, you covered my point, so it's fine.
Okay.
Also, when I listened to that episode that you did, like where you put all your dates in a spreadsheet, I love that. Like, that level of preparation is amazing.
And actually that episode took a long time to prepare because there was there was a lot of tape to it. So finally, let's end on what advice we would give to people starting out on the podcast journey.
My advice is just sort of what I've been saying throughout this panel, which is I really do think you need to do a bit of reflecting. Like if you decide or if you think, oh, this is something I want to do, you really do need to reflect on the time that it's going to take, not just to get the podcast ready, but the time it will keep taking you to get it ready and to bring it out into the world, and decide if, you know, dedicating that much time to something is something you're willing to do. The other piece of advice is I think you don't need to get so caught up in the technicals. Dee and I make this on our phones with free software. I feel like it can be very intimidating when people talk about mics and all of that. But really, I think if you focus a lot on making your content unique and compelling, so the fact that it's recorded on your phone, maybe the audio isn't professional quality, isn't going to really matter so much if what you're saying matters to you and could potentially matter to others, is my main piece of advice. And also, I think, you know, try to do it with someone who also supports you. Like, I'm very lucky I have Dee to when I said I have this idea, let's do this thing, you know, Dee was very supportive and we are very supportive of each other. So I hope if you are going to do a podcast, find people that can support you, because it's a lot of work to do by yourself.
Juriaden, you?
Yeah, find your niche, find your audience, think about your audience, and think about why it has to be you saying these things.
Izzy?
That's exactly what I was going to say. That is bang on. I think it's always worth asking as well, why this form and why now? So why a podcast rather than an article or a book or a conversation with your mum? And really thinking about what it is about this form and how to leverage that, and how to, like that intimacy thing that I was talking about as well. Like, does this story need to be told in an audio way? And if it does, how are you going to use audio to make it special and generous? And that question of why now, it's like a lot of what you guys were saying about Gay V Club and, you know, being a pop culture podcast and having this engagement with topicality and what is going on in the world. There's a clear why now, you know. There's a relevance and a reason that people are going to want to listen to that. Yeah, and I think you do really have to critically interrogate why you're the person to do it, which is part of what will keep you motivated to do the huge amount of work. You know, if it's something that you're genuinely obsessed by and you have access to information about and you're going to be excited by, you can sustain that level of work and passion that it takes to do. So, yeah, all great advice.
I guess my piece of advice would be, don't underestimate the amount of time that you are going to listen to this thing. So make sure that you take the time to listen to it. Like, I'm a big fan of going for taking a break, going for a walk and listening to the podcast, or doing the things that you would do while you listen to a podcast and really thinking to yourself, like, is this something that I would listen to? Bonus points if you can get your friends and family to listen to it and give you the feedback as well as to what's good and what they're enjoying and what they're not enjoying. So yeah, listen. Cool. I think that's it. Thank you everyone for your time. And good luck.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.